Harlem, New York, when Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked up to the entrance of the Cotton Club on West 142nd Street, wearing a navy blue suit tee. Hat had cost him 3 months' earnings from his policy. Operations, a crisp white shirt with French cuffs, and shoes polished until they reflected the street lights like mirrors. Dressed as well as any Hawaii. A businessman who frequented Harlem's most famous nightclub, the establishment where Duke Ellington had made his reputation, where Cab Calloway performed, where wealthy white people from downtown Manhattan and came to hear black musicians play wall, being served by black waiters in an establishment that would not, under any circumstances, allow black patrons to sit in the audience and enjoy the entertainment that black artists created. Johnson had come to the Cotton Club that evening because he'd been invited by Jacob Weinstein, a Jewish businessman who operated several legitimate enterprises in Harlem, and who suggested they meet at the Cotton Club to discuss a business arrangement that required privacy and discretion. A meeting that Weinstein apparently believed could occur despite the Cotton Club's notorious whites-only admission policy, because surely an exception could be made for someone as important as Bumpy Johnson. But Weinstein had been wrong about exceptions being made. As Johnson approached the entrance, where a doorman named Thomas Murphy stood checking the faces of everyone who tried to enter, and making instant decisions about who belonged in the Cotton Club and who didn't, Murphy stepped directly into Johnson's path, blocking the door with his substantial body, and said in a voice that carried across the sidewalk to the other people waiting to enter, "Where do you think you're going, boy? This club is for white patrons only. We don't serve coloreds here, except as entertainers and staff. You need to get back to Harlem where you belong, and stop trying to go places you're not wanted. Now move along before I call the police and have you arrested for loitering." Johnson stopped walking, looked at Murphy's face, saw the absolute certainty there that a doorman at the Cotton Club had the authority and the social backing to turn away any colored person regardless of who they were or what they'd accomplished, and Johnson understood immediately what was happening. The insult wasn't about Johnson personally. Murphy probably didn't even know who Johnson was, didn't recognize one of the most powerful criminals in Harlem standing in front of him. The insult was about race, about the fundamental assumption built into establishments like the Cotton Club that white people could come to Harlem to be entertained by black musicians and served by black staff while simultaneously excluding black patrons from the audience. That white people could profit from black culture while maintaining absolute segregation that ensured black people remain servants and performers, but never equal sharing the same spaces. Behind Johnson, the line of white patrons waiting to enter the club watched this confrontation with expressions ranging from amusement to mild discomfort to approval, waiting to see whether this well-dressed colored man would make trouble or would accept his dismissal quietly, the way colored people were supposed to accept being told they didn't belong in white spaces. Johnson could feel their eyes on his back, could hear a few murmured comments about uppity coloreds and knowing their place, and he understood that arguing with Murphy would accomplish nothing except giving these white patrons entertainment at his expense would result in police being called and Johns on being arrested or beaten or both would become a story they tell their friends about the colored man who tried to force his way into the Cotton Club and had been properly dealt with by the authorities. So Johnson did something that required more self-control than most men possessed. He smiled. Not a genuine smile, but the kind of cold, measured expression that suggested he was memorizing Murphy's face in this moment and would remember both long after Murphy had forgotten this interaction. Johnson held Murphy's gaze for 3 seconds, long enough that Murphy's expression shifted from confident contempt to slight uncertainty as he recognized something in Johnson's eyes that suggested this hadn't ended the way Murphy thought it had ended. Then Johnson nodded on a gesture that could have meant acceptance or could have meant something else entirely, turned away from the Cotton Club entrance and walked back down West 142nd Street toward Lenox Avenue, his posture erect, his pace unhurried, giving no indication to anyone watching that he'd just been publicly humiliated and dismissed like he was nothing. Johnson walking through Harlem's evening streets without any particular destination, just walking to give himself time to think and to let his anger settle enough that he could think strategically rather than emotionally. He found himself standing outside the Savoy Ballroom on Lenox Avenue, watching colored patrons, working people, professionals, families entering an establishment that welcomed them, that was owned and operated by black businessmen, that provided entertainment and social opportunities without the humiliation that came from trying to enter white establishments that treated black people as servants or criminals or both. And standing there watching people enter the Savoy, Johnson had a realization that would change not just his own thinking, but eventually would change the economic structure of Harlem's entertainment industry in ways that would echo for decades. The Cotton Club was in Harlem on a Harlem street employing Harlem musicians and Harlem staff, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars annually from white people who came to Harlem specifically to visit the Cotton Club. But despite being physically located in Harlem and despite depending entirely on black talent and black labor, the Cotton Club was owned by white businessmen, operated according to white rules, and excluded the black community from participating as patrons. The establishment extracted wealth from Harlem, took the creativity of black musicians, the labor of black workers, the cultural cash of being located in Harlem, while giving almost nothing back to the community except minimum wage employment for the musicians and staff it couldn't avoid hiring. What Johnson realized standing outside the Savoy was that this arrangement, white people owning establishments in Harlem that profited from black culture while excluding black patrons, existed only because black Harlem lacked the power and the organizational capacity to challenge it. The Cotton Club's owners assumed they could maintain their discriminatory policies indefinitely because what could black Harlem do about it? Black patrons couldn't force their way in, black musicians needed the employment too badly to boycott. Black workers couldn't afford to quit their jobs on principle when jobs were scarce during the Depression. The Cotton Club's owners had calculated correctly that individual black people lacked the power to challenge an established white-owned business that had wealthy white patrons and political connections protecting it. But what the Cotton Club's owners hadn't calculated, what they couldn't have anticipated, was that someone with Bumpy Johnson's resources and Bumpy Johnson's connections and Bumpy Johnson's willingness to use criminal methods for purposes beyond just making money would decide that being turned away from the Cotton Club's door was an insult that demanded a response not through violence, but through systematic economic warfare designed to make the Cotton Club's discriminatory policies so costly that the establishment either changed or failed. Johnson walked to a payphone and made 3 phone calls that would set everything in motion. The first call was to Theodore Teddy Green, Johnson's attorney and closest advisor. The second call was to Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of policy, who led substantial gambling operations throughout Harlem and who'd been Johnson's mentor before Johnson built his own independent organization. The third call was to Adam Clayton Powell, Sr., the minister of Abyssinian Baptist Church, who was one of Harlem's most influential legitimate leaders and who'd been fighting discrimination for decades, but who'd never had the kind of raw power necessary. What actually forced white establishments to change, rather than just preaching about how discrimination was morally wrong. By midnight, Johnson had assembled people in the back room of a speakeasy, his own top associates, representatives from other black policy operators, union officials who controlled colored workers in service industries, ministers from major Harlem churches, and several black professionals, including doctors and lawyers, who'd experienced their own humiliations at white establishments. Johnson stood at the head of the table and described what had happened at the Cotton Club, speaking in his characteristic quiet voice. That made people lean forward to hear him, and as he spoke, he watched faces around the table change from curiosity about why they'd been summoned to anger about what Johnson was describing too. Something that looked like hunger, because they understood that if Bumpy Johnson was assembling this particular group of people, then he was planning something substantial, something that went beyond his personal revenge. The Cotton Club turned me away tonight, Johnson said, his voice carrying that particular controlled intensity that people who knew him recognized as more dangerous than shouting, because I'm colored. The doorman called me boy and told me to get back to Harlem, where I belong. The irony, of course, is that the Cotton Club is in Harlem. It's on West 142nd Street, right in the middle of our neighborhood. It employs our musicians, our waiters, our cooks, our cleaning staff. It makes its money from being low-cat and in Harlem and from featuring black entertainment, but it won't let black people sit in the audience. It takes everything from us, our talent, our labor, our neighborhood's reputation, and gives us nothing back except minimum wages and the privilege of serving white people who come to Harlem to be entertained by our culture while making sure we understand we're not good enough to share their tea. Abel's Johnson paused, letting his words settle. Watching the faces around the table, several people nodded, recognizing their own experiences in what Johnson described, understanding that the Cotton Club's discrimination wasn't unique, but was instead representative of a broader pattern where white people profited from black culture while maintaining strict segregation that ensured black people remained subordinate. But here's what the Cotton Club's owners don't understand, Johnson continued, his voice dropping even lower, forcing everyone to strain to hear him. They don't understand that they're vulnerable in ways they haven't considered. The Cotton Club depends on black labor. Every musician, every waiter, every cook, every person who makes that establishment function is colored. The Cotton Club depends on being located in Harlem. Its entire appeal to white downtown patrons is that it offers an exotic experience of coming to a black neighborhood, ought to see black entertainment, and the Cotton Club depends on Harlem tolerating its presence, depends on us not making trouble, not organizing resistance, not using the power we actually have to make operating a discriminatory establishment in our neighborhood so difficult and so expensive that it becomes unsustainable. Johnson stood up now, began pacing behind the table, his intensity building. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to teach the Cotton Club's owners that extracting wealth from Harlem while insulting Harlem's people carries a cost. We're not going to. We'll burn the place down. That would just give them insurance money and sympathy. We're not going to attack their white patrons. That would give police justification to crack down on all of us. Instead, we're going to make operating the Cotton Club so difficult, so expensive, and so problematic that the owners conclude they have two choices. Either they open the Cotton Club to black patrons and end their discriminatory policies, or they sell the establishment to black owners who will operate it as an integrated venue. Either way, the current arrangement, white people profiting from black culture, while excluding black people from participating as equals, and what followed was detailed planning as Johnson and the others developed a strategy that combined labor organizing, economic pressure, community mobilization, and the kind of subtle intimidation that criminals understood how to apply without triggering police response. The plan had multiple components that would be implemented simultaneously. Labor organization. Every black employee of the Cotton Club would be contacted and asked to participate in coordinated action. Musicians would be asked to demand higher wages and better working conditions, threatening to strike if demands weren't met. Waiters and kitchen staff would be organized to slow down service subtly, making the Cotton Club's operations less efficient without doing anything so obvious that they could be fired for sabotage. The goal was to increase the Cotton Club's labor costs and reduce its service quality. It was that white patrons began complaining, and that operating profits declined, supply disruptions. The Cotton Club depended on various suppliers for food, liquor, linens, and other essentials through J. Johnson's connections and through St. Clair's connections. These suppliers would be contacted and given a choice: stop doing business with the Cotton Club or face problems with their other Harlem customers, since most suppliers did substantial business through Harlem. Losing access to Harlem's broader market was more costly than losing the Cotton Club's business. The suppliers who agreed to stop servicing the Cotton Club would force the establishment to find alternative suppliers at higher costs and with less reliability. Community pressure. Harlem's churches and community organizations would begin public campaigns criticizing the Cotton Club's discriminatory policies, making it a subject of sermons and community meetings, creating social pressure that made the Cotton Club's racism explicit in public rather than unspoken and ignored. The goal wasn't necessarily to stop white patrons from visiting. White people would do what they wanted regardless of what hour at Black Harlem thought, but to create enough public controversy that the Cotton Club's policies became indefensible and embarrassing. Political complications through connections with corrupt police and politici, and minor legal and regulatory problems would be created for the Cotton Club. Health inspections would suddenly find violations that required expensive fixes. Fire safety reviews would identify concerns that needed addressing. Liquor license renewals would be delayed, creating uncertainty about whether the club could legally serve alcohol. None of these problems would shut down the Cotton Club, but collectively they would cost money and attention, and would make operating the business more complicated. Economic competition. Johnson and St. Clair would invest in establishing or supporting alternative entertainment venues in Harlem that welcomed Black patrons, venues that could compete with the Cotton Club by offering similar quality entertainment in integrated settings. If Black musicians could earn comparable or better money performing at integrated venues, if Black workers could find employment at establishments that didn't practice discrimination, then the Cotton Club would struggle to maintain the Black talent and labor it depended on. The strategy was sophisticated and comprehensive, combining methods that ranged from completely legitimate labor organizing to barely legal intimidation, leveraging every form of power that Black Harlem possessed to challenge an establishment that had assumed Black Harlem was powerless, and everyone in that room understood they were participating in something unprecedented. A moment when criminal resources and criminal methods were being weaponized not for personal profit, but for a social goal. And Bumpy Johnson's anger about being turned away from the Cotton Club was being channeled into systematic organizing that could actually change the economic structure of Harlem's entertainment industry. The campaign against the Cotton Club began when Duke Ellington, who'd made his reputation performing at the Cotton Club and who remained the establishment's biggest draw, announced to the Club's management that he was demanding a significant increase in his band's compensation and improved working conditions. When management refused, pointing out that Ellington had a contract, Ellington responded that contracts could be broken and that he'd received multiple offers from other venues that would pay him substantially more. The threat was credible because Johnson and St. Clair had indeed contacted Ellington with offers to perform at alternative venues, and Ellington, who'd experienced his own humiliations from Cotton Club management over the years, was willing to leverage those offers to extract better terms or to leave entirely if better terms weren't provided. Simultaneously, problems began appearing throughout the Cotton Club's operations. Kitchen staff started working more alley, claiming they were being careful about food preparation, but actually coordinating to reduce the number of meals they could prepare per hour, creating longer wait times. Waiters began making small mistakes, delivering wrong orders, forgetting drinks, taking longer than necessary to bring checks. Not enough to justify firing anyone, but enough to create frustration among patrons who expected perfect service. Suppliers began experiencing problems delivering on schedule, trucks broke down, orders were misfilled. Deliveries that should have arrived Monday wouldn't show up until Dean's Day, forcing the Cotton Club to scramble for alternatives and to pay premium prices for rush deliveries. Soon, the Cotton Club's management was struggling with problems they couldn't quite identify the source of, but that were clearly costing money and affecting the customer experience. Duke Ellington was threatening to leave, which would devastate the club's hobby, leading to attract white patrons. Labor costs were increasing as they gave raises to key employees to prevent them from leaving. Supply costs were increasing as they paid premiums for reliable deliveries, and mysteriously, various regulatory agencies were suddenly finding problems that required expensive fixes. The Cotton Club's owner, Oni Madden, a white gangster who built his fortune on bootlegging and who'd purchased the Cotton Club, understood that someone was organizing this pressure, that these problems weren't coincidental. Madden had connections to other white organized crime figures, had political influence, had resources that should have allowed him to identify and crush whoever was causing trouble. But when Madden reached out to his contacts asking for help identifying who was behind the Cotton Club's problems, he kept hearing the same name, Bumpy Johnson. And when Madden tried to use his mob connections to pressure Johnson into stopping whatever he was doing, Madden discovered that none of the white gangsters he knew were willing to intervene in a conflict between Madden and Johnson over what was essentially a racial issue in Harlem, an area where white gangsters had limited influence and where Johnson had built relationships that made him more powerful in Harlem than any outside figure could be. After weeks of mounting problems and mounting costs, Madden received a message asking him to meet with Theodore Green, Johnson's attorney. Madden agreed, assuming this was an attempt to negotiate some kind of settlement, and he sat in Green's office, listening to an explanation of exactly what was happening and exactly what would be required to make the problem stop. "Mr. Madden," Green said, speaking with careful precision, "the operational difficulties you've been experiencing at the Cotton Club are the result of organized response to your establishment's policy of refusing to admit Negro patrons. The policy is offensive to Harlem's community, is particularly offensive given that your establishment is located in Harlem and depends entirely on black musicians and black staff, and is no longer acceptable to the people who make your business possible. The difficulties will continue and will intensify until you announce that the Cotton Club will open its doors to Negro patrons, that colored customers will be welcomed and served with the same courtesy provided to white customers, and that you'll take concrete steps to demonstrate this change is genuine." Madden, his face flushed with anger, responded harshly, "You're telling me that colors are sabotaging my business, that Bumpy Johnson is behind this? I can have that man killed tomorrow. I've got connections throughout the city. You think some Harlem policy operator can threaten me?" Green's expression didn't change. "Mr. Madden, you're welcome to attempt retaliation against Mr. Johnson if you believe that's wise. But I should inform you that Mr. Johnson has anticipated that possibility and has taken precautions. If anything happens to Mr. Johnson, the campaign against your establishment will intensify rather than stopping, because Mr. Johnson has organized a coalition of people who will continue this pressure regardless of what happens to him personally, and more importantly, Mr. Mad. And you should consider whether the Cotton Club is worth dying over, because if you attempt violence against Mr. Johnson will respond with violence against you, and you'll discover that you have less protection in Harlem than you believe you have." The threat was clear and was backed by a reality that Madden understood once his anger cooled enough to think strategically. He could probably have Johnson killed if he committed sufficient resources to it, but doing so would trigger gang warfare that would cost more than the Cotton Club was worth, would bring attention from law enforcement that Madden wanted to avoid, and would solve nothing because the coalition Johnson had organized would continue pressuring the Cotton Club even after Johnson was dead. Madden was Fauci, and the same calculation that had defeated other white gangsters who had tried to maintain control in Harlem against Johnson's resistance. That fighting Johnson in Harlem cost more than any pause. Sybil benefit from winning. What exactly are you demanding? Madden finally asked, his voice controlled again, recognizing this was a negotiation rather than a situation he could solve through violence. Green pulled out a document he'd prepared, a proposed announcement that Madden would issue, stating the Cotton Club would no longer refuse service based on race. The announcement didn't require Madden to actively recruit black patrons or to make dramatic changes to how the club operated, just required him to publicly commit that colored customers who attempted to enter would be admitted and served rather than being turned away at the door. The announcement would be publicized through Harlem's newspapers and churches, would be verified by having prominent black community members attempt to enter the club and be admitted it, and would end the campaign against the Cotton Club if Madden maintained the policy genuinely than just issuing false statements while continuing to discriminate in practice. Madden spent time negotiating specific language and specific commitments, trying to preserve as much of the Cotton Club's existing character as possible, while accepting the fundamental requirement that racial discrimination at the door had to end. Finally, Oni Madden issued a statement announcing that the Cotton Club would welcome patrons regard less of race, that the club's historical policy of admitting only white customers was being changed, that colored customers who wished to attend performances would be admitted and served with courtesy and professionalism. The announcement was met with skepticism from many in Harlem's community, who assumed this was merely a public relations gesture that wouldn't translate into actual change. To verify the policy was genuine, Theodore Green organized a test when a group of well-dressed black professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, business people arrived at the Cotton Club and attempted to enter for the evening's performance. The doorman, who'd presumably been instructed about the policy change, admitted them without incident. They were seated in the audience, were served by waiters, were treated with the same professionalism provided to white patrons, and were able to enjoy Duke Ellington's performance from the audience rather than being excluded while their culture was performed for white people's entertainment. The integration of the Cotton Club sent shock waves through Harlem. If the Cotton Club, the most famous whites-only establishment in Harlem, could be forced to integrate through organized economic pressure, then the model could be applied to other discriminatory establishments. Over the following months, Johnson and his coalition applied similar pressure to other venues that practiced discrimination, gradually forcing integration throughout Harlem's entertainment industry. Some establishments integrated immediately rather than fighting, understanding that resistance would be costly. Others tried to resist, but discovered they faced the same mounting problems and mounting costs that had forced Madden to surrender. But perhaps more importantly than the immediate victories, what Johnson accomplished after being turned away from the Cotton Club demonstrated something that would influence civil rights organizing for the next 3 decades, that economic power, when organized systematically and applied strategically, could force changes that moral appeals and legal challenges couldn't produce. The methods Johnson pioneered, combining labor organization, supply disruptions, community mobilization, and targeted economic pressure into comprehensive campaigns against discriminatory establishments, would be studied and replicated by civil rights activists throughout the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s as they worked to dismantle segregation across America. And Bumpy Johnson, who'd walked away quietly from the Cotton Club's door rather than making a scene or resorting to violence, had accomplished something that mattered more than any immediate revenge could have mattered. He demonstrated that being told, "Gee, back to Harlem, where you belong," could become the catalyst for taking control of Harlem's economic institutions, for forcing white-owned establishments to either integrate or leave, for proving that Black Harlem had power that white people had dismissed or ignored, and that power, when organized and applied strategically, could change the rules that had governed who belonged, where, and who had the right to exclude whom. The doorman who called Bumpy Johnson boy and told him to get back to Harlem probably never knew that his insult triggered everything that fall. Owed probably continued working at the Cotton Club. After it integrated, probably never understood that his casual racism had been the spark that ignited a systematic campaign to break down the barriers T had people like him maintained through casual contempt delivered at doorways throughout the city. But that insult and Johnson's quiet walk-away followed by strategic organizing that changed Harlem's entertainment landscape became legend in the community, became a story told about how power isn't always about violence or immediate retaliation, but can be about patience and organization, NAP, applying pressure until institutions break under the weight of their own contradictions. "You don't belong here, boy," were the words. And Bumpy Johnson's response, walking away quietly, organizing comprehensively, applying pressure systematically, changing Harlem permanently, proved that belonging isn't something white doormen grant or deny, but is something people with sufficient intelligence and sufficient determination claim for themselves and for their communities. That was the insult that changed Harlem. That was the quiet walkaway that broke the Cotton Club's color barrier. That was how one man's humiliation became an entire community's victory, not through violence or through destruction, but through the harder work of organizing people and resources toward a goal that required patience and coordination and willingness to maintain pressure until the powerful concluded that maintaining discrimination cost more than abandoning it. The Cotton Club integrated because Bumpy Johnson decided being turned away from its door demanded a response that would matter beyond just his personal satisfaction. And that decision to respond strategically rather than emotionally, to organize collectively rather than acting individually, to pursue lasting change rather than immediate revenge, established precedents and demonstrated methods that would influence how Black Americans fought for their rights for generations to come.